Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you could make it here tonight here at BCA for a marvelous program. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet, my name is Heather Farrell. I'm the curator and director of exhibitions, and I am so thrilled you could join us. And thank you for coming to our conversation with Jane Kent and Major Jackson. And this is part of our programming for Jane Kent's solo exhibition, Between the Covers, now on view here at BCA. You can see it right there through the back gallery. We are very pleased to welcome Jane and Major for tonight's conversation, where they will discuss the benefits and challenges of collaboration across text and image, as well as their most recent project, Why I Write Poetry, forthcoming from Grenfell Press next year. For me personally, it's been a pleasure to work with Jane over the past 2 years, and I've learned so much, Jane. Thank you. And organizing Between the Covers has really been a remarkable exhibition. And this is an exhibition of the artist's ongoing series of artist books, prints, and working drawings. And they've been done over the past 25 years. Jane has created these artist books in collaboration with 6 writers or poets, including Major. And for the first time, these artist books are being exhibited all together at BCA, and it's such a privilege. Jane is not only an internationally recognized artist and printmaker, she is also a valued art educator in our community, where she serves as a professor of studio art at University of Vermont, helping guide future generations of artists. BCA is committed to presenting artists such as Jane to our community and helping to support and debut the creation of new work of those working in Vermont. And I'm very happy that working with Jane, we were able to include 2 new prints from Jane's upcoming collaboration with Major on Why I Write Poetry, as well as a catalog that's forthcoming called Between the Covers, which will be published by Thanksgiving. In addition to our presenters tonight, I would like to thank Vermont Humanities and the Molly Ruprecht Fund for Visual Art at the University of Vermont for tonight's program. A reminder to all of you, this is a hybrid event and such that we have both people here in person as well as a Zoom audience. So I'd like to say just a few quick words on the format. For those of us joining on Zoom, please use your Zoom Q&A feature to pose your question at the end of the program for Jane and our Major. Sarah Jane, our programs assistant, will pose the question for our on-site audience. There's also a chat feature if you want to share a comment. And a reminder to all of you here tonight that tonight's program is recorded and will be posted to our BCA YouTube channel. After my introduction, I'll turn the time over to Kristen Dykstra, who will introduce our speakers and help moderate tonight's conversation, including the Q&A. Because we are recording the program and offering it via Zoom, if you have a question here in our in-person audience, please raise your hand so Kristen can bring the microphone to you. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I'd like to turn the time over to Kristen to introduce our speakers.
Thank you. There is just one seat left up in front here. We also have these very comfortable cushioned things over here on the side if you would like to explore the world of the cushioned seat. In fact, we have one on each side. So help us if people come in late, which we actually heard we may have some late arrivals, to find them a comfortable place to sit tonight. It is our great pleasure to welcome both Jane and Major tonight. I would like to start by pointing out how rare it is that you get to have a conversation about artist books, and how special it is that we can do that with 2 people who have such substantial accomplishments in their own arenas, and also who have mentored so many other people here in the Burlington, Vermont area over the years. Heather, our curator, has emphasized that artist books as our starting point will be taken as works of art like paintings or sculptures, but in book form. And so we're beginning with that proposition that this is not the same thing as a book with an illustration, which implies that the visual art would play a secondary or a supporting role. Instead, it's useful to envision artist books as a genre other to books with illustration. So what does it mean to realize a book project that is other in this sort of way? What does it mean to view the artist book from the vantage point of the artist, and then again from the vantage point of the writer? Jane and Major are going to explore the benefits and challenges of moving between image and word, as well as sharing relevant context from art, literature, and life. And it will be my role to cut them off, because I'm going to tell you there are so many ideas and there's so much energy and it's so exciting that it's really, I apologize in advance, because I'm gonna feel so rude. But we also want to leave some time for audience Q&A. We're actually gonna do that a little bit before 7. And then that will leave time, we hope at the end, to move circa 7:15 into the actual exhibition space with Jane and Major, so that you can have a different kind of space to chat with them about their work and their ideas, and see those things come to life on the walls of BCA. I'm going to read bios, although I think, again, you know, in many ways, people probably know you well here, but we're going to start with Jane. Jane's solo exhibitions, among them are the International Print Biennale at Newcastle upon Tyne, C.G. Berner in New York, International Print Center of New York, the Mississippi Museum of Art, and of course, we're abridging their bios, because their bios are, of course, quite a bit longer and very impressive. Selected awards include the Barbara and Thomas Putnam Fellowship from MacDowell Colony, Yaddo Artist Fellowships, and the National Endowment for the Arts Artist Fellowship. Jane's work is found in public collections, including the Rare Books Division and the Prints Division at Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., the Spencer Collection at the New York Public Library, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the Print and Word Collection at Victoria and Albert Museum, the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale, and the Whitney Museum of American Art. She divides her time between Burlington and New York City, and Jane is professor of studio art at the University of Vermont. Major Jackson, welcome back. He is the author of 6 books of poetry, most recently Razzle Dazzle, New and Selected Poems, which was published in 2023. His edited volumes include Best American Poetry, Renga for Obama, and the Library of America's County Cullen Collected Poems. He's also the author of A Beat Beyond, the Selected Prose of Major Jackson, edited by, is it Amor or Amor? Amor Coley. A recipient of fellowships from the Academy of American Poets, John S. Guggenheim Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Arts, Jackson has published poems and essays in many publications, including The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and World Literature Today. He lives in Nashville, Tennessee, where he is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities at Vanderbilt University. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and serves as the poetry editor of the Harvard Review. He taught for 18 years in the English department at the University of Vermont. We are delighted to welcome Jane and Major back to Burlington. We decided tonight that I would start as a moderator posing questions. And so are you ready for your first question?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Door number 1.
Door number 1. Okay. And I'm going to take a seat and invite you, if you feel like standing up, go ahead. But we'll relax. So Jane and Major, both of you seem to be animated by precursors coming out of the field of artist books. So when we were setting up this conversation, Jane actually mentioned a number of significant artist books that made you curious about the potential relationships between word and image. So I'd like to ask you to share how exposure to that history or any of those earlier works may have sent you down the path that eventually brought you here tonight.
Here's your mic.
Okay. I went to art school and at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia and was introduced to artist books because we had a class for 2 years at Lessing J. Rosenwald's collection. And he started the largest print collection in the United States. He was the heir to the Sears Corporation, which eventually went to the National Gallery, and we went every other week. And I remember distinctly when he introduced Blake, Songs of Innocence, and Matisse's Jazz. And I had never seen anything like this. I was completely excited by this format. And so then that's where it started. And I was continuing my interest in the sense that when I was in art school, I made a book. It was so hard to do. And I knew that I wanted to do it at some point later on. I wasn't ready to do it when I first started. So, so I just held on to that as a possibility because it just excited me that you could have this book form and you wouldn't know anything about it unless you opened it up and entered into this world and tried to meet it on its own terms. And it just was so exciting. And I really want to say before I say anything else, they are hard to make, hard to see, hard to sell, hard to show. They are an incredibly peculiar endeavor. They are not reasonable. So it's incredibly intense work. It's very labor intensive if you want them to look good. And so it's a stubborn enterprise, absolutely a stubborn enterprise. And I mean, I guess that appeals to me because when I started doing this, the whole point was to get them out in the world, you know, not to put them in a drawer. So that's been my motivation the whole time. And I'm gratified to say that they have gone out in the world. And I ended up making this project that I had no idea it was going to be a lifelong project, but that's what it's turned out to be. Anyway, I mean, I could go on, but I'll stop.
Let me ask, I wanted to see if this works for you then. It's a little hollow.
Like this? Fast learner.
My education began also in Philadelphia, particularly at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And there's a great collection of Duchamp. And if you go into that room, you'll encounter some pretty iconic artworks. One of them being the Bride Strip Bear by her bachelors. Unbeknownst to me, when I was younger, I would kind of stare at this cracked glass, and as any young person, wonder why this was art, particularly with the crack part. But the odorless made sense. And then when I got older is when I discovered his drawings and his plans. And I love the back and forth conversation between the text, the image, his notes. So secondly, I would say was a bookstore in Philadelphia on South Street. My friend John Gennari will probably remember this bookstore. I want to say it was about 5th and South Street. And it was a used bookstore that had not only used books, but also ephemera. And that's where I discovered broadsides. And I loved these broadsides that had collectible broadsides too, that had a single poem with image going around it. And it was there that I also discovered art books. They were what you might call zines today, but carefully laid out and put together. I love as much attention that was paid to the visual art as was the text. It wasn't until later in which I started reading about the surrealist and the Russian futurists that I understand that there was this kind of education around kind of the graphic nature of books, and very intentionally, I want to say, that kind of move away from the book as this kind of exalted text. Later, I met some great artists like Jane Kent, who fulfilled my desire. Some of you know I have great musician envy. And in fact, I was recalling John and I had a band called jazzpoetry.com, and every Burlington Book Festival, not every, but there was summer, we were the jam. We performed right in this room with some solid Burlington musicians. Equally strong, though, I would say, is my desire to kind of work with visual artists. One bookmaker friend, Janet Zwei, gave me several of her books, and I was very happy that Jane had showed me her collaborations with Richard Ford, who was a friend of mine from New Orleans and Jane's colleague at Princeton, and their piece, I think it was Privacy, and showed me her collaboration with Joyce Carol Oates. Well, I thought I hit the jackpot being in the same bed as those guys with Jane. So thank you, Jane. I also want to say one thing. Illuminated text. When I went to Trinity and saw that text as well, great possibilities kind of opened up for me as well.
So I'm going to ask you about the possibility of collaboration. Collaboration is obviously a topic of great current interest in contemporary arts and writing fields, and it's of special relevance to BCA right now because we do have collaborative works both on the second floor and on the first floor, but they're extremely different, right? What the mode of collaboration is can be quite a contrast. And so I'll invite you back another day to see the Art Lord's work downstairs. But tonight I would actually like to ask Jane and Major to give us an insight into how each of you sees your projects meshing word and image, and what collaboration means to you.
Okay, I'll start. I want to say I never see anything right away. I don't have any preconceived notion about what anything is going to look like, or it takes a while for it to sit with me. I read it over and over and over. I draw and draw and draw. And then out of that, I start to understand a relationship between text and image. I'm particularly interested in that which is not fixed. So it takes me a really long time to takes me a long time to not make the work I always make. So I have to do it over and over and over again, because that's the whole point, as far as I'm concerned, to make things I have not seen myself make before. And I just work. I know how to work. That's one of my strengths. And that's what I do. I mean, I'm not very talky about that. I really just go to work. And I twist and turn things. I do things where you can see I do things 10 times, 20 times, over and over and over again. And then I find a joy. I mean, it's really like I seek that, and then I find it, and then I commit, and then I make it. It's in the making that the whole project emerges. I don't know, does that answer your question?
I think it is. It sounds like collaboration isn't a commitment until I make a commitment in a way that I find delightful and fascinating.
And it's with the work. It's not with the person.
Mm-hmm.
It's work to work.
I think part of what's implicit or wasn't said is that I give the poems to Jane, much in the same way that Joyce Carol Oates, I think, and Richard gave you their pieces of writing first. And that takes a great deal of pressure off of me, although I have been tempted to go back and like I've seen Jane's work and have been triggered into some ideas of how to respond. But typically I give Jane the poems. And what I admire, what I currently admire and have admired is that sense of a dedication to that aspect of her work that seems to be seeking. And if you look at the work, it feels very almost savage-like in its search. It seems very elemental, very inquirous, very curious. And it emerges for me as this, to use your word, a made thing, but I can see behind that making this kind of restless churning of interpretation of the work. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
And that is not fixed. It feels very kind of improvisatory until you hear the sound of the piece, maybe see the sound of the piece. But I'm gonna stick with the music part of it that kind of triggers your arm, triggers your hand into making.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's
As a
right.
response. Yeah.
I think that's right. And the other thing is that I love having these words, living with these words. I love that writers speak. I love that they bother to speak. You know, I think I really appreciate that. I mean, I'm very chatty, but I'm not very talkative in general. You know, so I appreciate that there's this intention of actually saying something. Yeah. And so read the text over and over and over again. I draw, I read years. Privacy, I had it for I'd worked on it for almost 7 years. It's not the only thing I do. So, I mean, just so you know that, I mean, but I live with it for a long time and I love that I inhabit it. I really inhabit it. And then I go to make it. I know a couple of things before I start. As a print artist, I'm completely committed to printmaking and methods of making. So then I figure out which of all the things I might want to do, what kind of process. I know how to do a lot of things. I don't actually do it all myself anymore, thankfully, because there are people who do some of these processes better than I do myself. And I'm happy to work with other people. You know, but there's been a lot of figuring out along the way. And the privacy, I printed all of them myself. I work with a publisher named Leslie Miller of Grenfell Press. And she's probably exactly like me. You know, we barely talk. We grunt a lot. It's like, and it's been a 30-year relationship and she's excellent at what she does. So, I mean, I will say something else, that these projects are built on trust. The writer gives me the text, and then the question, I've been asked, what does trust look like? And I say, it looks like these projects, because there isn't a lot of conversation. I was thinking it might be nice to do a project where we actually talk to each other. Yeah. But I mean, that would just be a different way to organize it, right? Which I'd be open to as well. But it is really interesting that that there is this consent that goes on, and I mean, I feel very lucky that I work with these writers and they do trust me. You know, I think that's amazing.
It see my friend Patricia Julian here, who I want to call these when the composer or when the artist responds to the text. I want to refer to them, as my wife referred, moments of reverse ekphrasis. Typically, writers are responding to works of visual art, but it's rare actually where the artist or the composer kind of lives with the text prior to. And I'm typically excited by work that is not overly literal in its interpretation. The greatest honor you do me is if the work kind of launches you into some area that typically that the work doesn't invite, but insinuates.
If I can follow up on that idea of making as seeking and perhaps wandering, right, and exploring, then I'd like to highlight for a moment the way Jane's show is laid out when you walk into the room, which is the first wall you see is actually Jane experimenting, Jane trying new approaches. And I had this great moment when she told me that the image that we chose, she uses a lot of working drawings. And we liked this very much and put it on the poster for this event. And then Jane told me, yes, that was one of the rejected pieces. And I thought that was so great because I think it's such an insight into the choices you made to include this in the exhibition. And then we are getting a lot of reactions where people walk in and they see the completed piece and they want to look back and forth between that maker's wall, right? And then the completed object. So I guess I wanted to ask you both to talk about that process of making as wandering, as finding things, but also rejecting even very lovely things along the way.
Well, I can just say the wandering actually suits the flaneur. You know, the idea of the flaneur. But that piece, so I did all these mock-ups. I did about 10 of them, only a few are in this on that wall. But that one we ended up printing and printing, taking it to completion. It was on the printer who is Andrew Mockler, actually, who printed it. And we got all the way to the end and Leslie put the text on there and I hated it. And the reason I hated it, it's all very practical. The type, in order to fit all the type on the sheet, that size of the sheet, the type had to be really small, which meant that the image was so dominant. And I didn't like that because I didn't want to overpower the words. That was never my intention. So I rejected it. So we started over. And that's what the new one is. And it's much more delicately made. There isn't so many layers of ink to make it so squishy. That's what the type was sitting on. Anyway, so it's, I mean, none of it is whim, these decisions. If it gets rejected, it's for something like that.
Would you like to add any examples of wandering as making or things you have rejected along the way?
Yeah. My life is a series of rejections. I think it has to be as a writer of poetry. I mentioned the word restless. I guess alongside that is a spirit of dissatisfaction. And the seeing part, however, feels almost imperative and necessary. I'm interested in how a poem evolves or works of art evolve, in which time is one of the kind of key factors that is impressing upon the making. And so I typically will write a draft of a poem and then put it away and then come back to it later. I think part of what Jane experienced as a kind of overpowering of the text is probably owed to a consideration, aesthetic consideration that came as a result of living with the art. I know that's typically my issue. in writing a poem, I probably have had numerous daily quotidian moments, and maybe have read headlines and maybe have listened to a recording from the 1940s, 1950s, and heard something or read something that impacted the next draft. The wandering is probably as crucial as the moment of composing. That spirit of letting life happens, which is why I recommended Frank O'Hara's poem, Why I Am Not a Painter, because what you hear, and this is, I think, one of the great innovations of art, is moving away from the work as a completed, exalted object to thinking about the centrality of process in our lives. And I think process, along with people's practice, has increased as a important moment to kind of organize our lives around. I think when Jane just said she knows how to work, she just works. I think that's a very individuated place of arrival for an artist. And you have to keep doing, you have to keep teaching yourself how to work and not settle into a vision or a routine that shuts down possibilities.
I also want to add that you have to be willing, again, you have to be willing to deal with the discomfort that comes from being in this universe. And it's really, it's actually a good place to be. I mean, I think it's a good place to be. And because that's where things start to become interesting. And I think that's an important part of it. So you have to put in the time.
So Major, I have a copy of that poem, and we had talked about Why I Am Not a Painter. Perhaps we even share the poem. We could do that right now if you would like to. Okay, I have copies that I'm going to bring around.
Show of hands, who has read this poem before? Fantastic. Good.
Also, if you have read this before, if you'd be willing to share with the neighbor, I think we may not have quite enough copies to go around. So
Why I Am Not a Painter. Frank O'Hara, New York School, first generation poet, born 1926, 1966, started off after a stint in the Navy, went to Harvard on the GI Bill, wound up working at MoMA selling postcards, and then moved up to become a curator. I think that's a great path, by the way, for any emergent writers to start selling postcards outside of MoMA. I'm not sure if they're going to. Frank O'Hara, as a result, had a number of friends in New York who were artists, and a good deal of his work is a conversation, one of them being Mike Goldberg, who you knew.
I didn't know.
You didn't know. You know his work. Okay. Why I Am Not a Painter. I am not a painter. I am a poet. Why? I think I would rather be a painter, but I am not. Well, for instance, Mike Goldberg is starting a painting. I drop in, sit down and have a drink, he says. I drink, we drink. I look up. You have sardines in it. Yes, it needed something there. Oh, I go, and the days go by, and I drop in again. The painting is going on, and I go, and the days go by. I drop in, the painting is finished. Where's sardines? All that's left is just letters. It was too much, Mike says. But me, one day I am thinking of a color, orange. I write a line about orange. Pretty soon, it is a whole page of words, not lines. Then another page. There should be so much more, not of orange, of words, of how terrible orange is and life. Days go by. It is even in prose. I am a real poet. My poem is finished and I haven't mentioned orange yet. It's 12 poems. I call it Oranges. And one day in the gallery, I see Mike's painting called Sardines. When we were on our phone call talking about Jane and I talking about collaboration, I think this particular poem probably sums up for both of us how we arrive at work and also how we kind of interact and engage in conversations, which feels like a very responsible, intellectual, moral thing to do. I'm starting to think about the public good and how necessary it is for artists to kind of continue these conversations. But for me, that compelling aspect of days go by and what time does, both time, but also atemporal time, what that does to the canvas, what that does to us, what does life do to us, and how that impacts how we see and get what we experience onto a canvas or in the poems. Also, how process works. You start out thinking you're going to write a poem about oranges or paint, put sardines into it, and then it evolves. And that journey is why I live. I live to be led by the words or led by the poem.
It's really interesting to listen to because if you notice in the gallery, I've done a whole bunch of work with clocks.
Yes.
because of time. I mean, I think as you get older, you think about time anyway. I mean, I hate to say that, but that's true. And but I have always started with an object. You might not see it, but I always start with an object and it twists and it turns and that's it's like iteration after iteration and it mutates and it becomes a piece of fruit or
I was just about to say, I remember one draft, I thought it was the cross section of a bunch of oranges, orange slices.
Grapefruit.
Grapefruit, yes. Which you were eating, if I remember.
Maybe.
Yeah.
But I don't think that the ideas are that deep for me. I would not say that I am thinking deeply. I always hope that the work is distinctive, that the ideas are available for people. You know, but it's just, I mean, I remember when I realized that the way you draw as a young artist, those are your drawings. You don't have to change it to be what you think a drawing should look like. It's the way you draw. And once I understood that, it was like I was released from a lot of pressure. You know, and maybe it's true with writing.
Well, I was, as you said that, several things came to mind. One of them is you probably not only self-affirmed what your voice and what your style, what your signature would look like, what your subject matter would be. It's very difficult, I want to say, to arrive at that because of the great weight of tradition and maybe even the bar, your own personal bar that you've set that you want to kind of arrive at. The other thing I was thinking about was your assurance with your materials. And that too is something that you journey towards. A number of my students have felt and currently feel as though that they have to have kind of $100 words inside of their poems. Like they need to sound a certain way. They need to engage language in a way that the great writers, canonical writers have done. And it too is liberating for them, for me to say, no, use the language that you grew up with, that your grandparents spoke, that your friends would use in the streets or in school.
It goes back to speaking, like the wonderful thing about speaking. And that's what I feel by drawing so much, that is what I'm doing. And when writers write so much, that's what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's because people don't often do enough of it. Speak, I mean, say something. I mean.
So I would like to take some of those things and actually flip them upside down in a way, because Jane, I heard you say you don't feel like you think deeply about things.
Yeah.
And yet, if one goes through your exhibition, you give this richness of attention to attention itself, to observation.
Right.
So I actually see you as thinking very deeply about observation. It's just over time, right? And over space. So I think that's quite fascinating. And then I think we could actually use that to come around. That attention to attention brings us to, why did you choose the Flaneur poem in the first place? I think that's probably not a coincidence.
No, I think it was really because it spoke of this modernist figure, the Flaneur, and in the history of artist books, that period of modernism is a very powerful period. That's the period that Matisse Jazz was done. That's when the whole thing about the modern artist book and the category that I think I'm working in is usually referred to with a French term, which we don't, it's livre d'artiste, but we don't really say that here. I mean, in America, because it's very, that's how I was taught. It was very pretentious to say livre d'artiste, but it's really the artist's book. It's American versus European.
Right.
But I think that no, I forgot what I was saying.
Trying to convince you that you're a deep thinker about the topic of attention.
I'm not saying I don't think at all, but I when I hear myself say that I see an object and I do it one way and then I do it another way, it's not complicated. You know, it's, people can understand what I'm saying. It isn't, the surprises are in the drawings themselves, is what I'm trying to say, or in the work itself, not in this statement about what my work is about. Like, I'd rather die than say that. Actually, people who know me know that. But I think that I mean, that's the whole point to me, is to make work that's distinctive.
Yes.
Figure out how to do that.
When you were saying you can't use that phrase, I was thinking, gosh, I would not want anyone to tell me that I couldn't use words, or and then I'm super canonical, so I'm always thinking about the past and how to speak to the past. And I don't think I would have come across the Flaneur had I not delved into Baudelaire and thought about, there was something I came across in a book, collaboration between Pierre Rivardi and Picasso, and all of those particular artists for whom, you know, it's almost like we have to put blue jeans on our intelligence and our reading. But again, I want to argue that if you are a hungry artist, it's all there for your absorption. But I'm thinking about your work, and I think too much in my work. And so what's been healing in a way is to collaborate with artists who bring a level of whimsy, bring a level of play, rather than, and keep in mind, I was brought to poetry because of social, political station in life that I was born into. So that's already there. But the joy in making and the joy of, I just sense a great deal of in your work aesthetic also, there's a vibrancy there. There's a play. And maybe that's the savage part I was mentioning earlier. Yeah. Y'all bothered by that? Me saying savage? No. Okay, all right. I'm talking about it, the inner art spirit. That's all. If you have colonialist notions, get that out of your mind.
I liked it.
Okay, good.
Yeah. I mean, the idea of play is a funny thing because I'm not like going weed when I'm drunk. I mean, I'm not necessarily happy either. But it is, but I will completely agree with the energy.
Yes.
That's right.
That
is there.
That's right.
I mean, I want them to be alive.
Yeah.
That's the point, I think, of all of this.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's play as artistic energy, but maybe Martha Nussbaum would also throw in that play is how adults learn to deal with very serious issues without being overwhelmed by anxiety, so that we can talk about things that seem unspeakable, right? Or at least unsettling in some way. Do you have that Flaneur poem ready to go?
I do
'Cause I
have.
have
It's
copies.
queued up. It's queued up. Yeah.
I will get the copies to the room.
While Kristen is doing that, did anyone have a question? Yes. That's great. I will give a definition. Yeah. A flaneur, typically a guy, but there's flaneuse. There's a flaneuse. Someone, as Baudelaire was describing, who had the great leisure, and added to leisure because if you were in Europe or even the States during the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, early 1900s, you had to work. So this was a figure of privilege who could walk their city. And this is also a time in which we are thinking about the dichotomy between, or the move away from rural environments to urban environments. So in a way, the flaneur is a creation of urban environments. Not that you didn't have folks that wandered along country roads, but the flaneur took in the city and often wrote about the city or participated at a remove. This poem found me. For 15 years. I taught at NYU, one class a semester in the creative writing program. And often I would arrive early in the morning, first flight out of Burlington, which is typically 6:30, and land around 7:30, 8. Actually, sometimes, this is true story, as I'm getting off the train, Jane is getting on the train to come teach at UVM, which was like, maybe out in Brooklyn, right? Maybe our collaboration started then. Yeah. And so I would get a haircut. I would go to my favorite diner, and then I would sit in Washington Square Park, or I would go up to Central Park, Upper West Side, and insinuate myself as an observer in the lives of New Yorkers. And so this poem emerged out of that. The flaneur tends a well-liked summer cocktail. The flaneur tends a well-liked summer cocktail curbside on an ARP-like table. He's alone, of course, in the arts district, as it were, legs folded, swaying a foot, so that his body seems to summon some deep immensity from all that surrounds. Dust shadows inching near a late 30-ish couple, debating the post-galactic abyss of sex with strangers, tourists ambling by only to disappear into the street's gloomy mouth. A young Italian woman bending to retrieve a dropped Metro card, its black magnetic strip facing up. A lone speckled brown pigeon breaking from a flock of rock doves, then landing near a crushed fast food wrapper newly tossed by a bike messenger. The man chortling after a sip of flaxen colored beer, remembering that in the Gospel of John, the body and glory converge, linked to incarnation. And so perhaps we manifest each other. A tiny shower of sparks erupting from the knife sharpener's truck, who daily leans a blade into stone. A cloudscape reflected in the rear windshield of a halted taxi, where inside a trans woman applies auburn lipstick. The warlike insignia on the lapel jacket of a white gloved doorman who, opening a glass door, gets a whiff of a dowager's thick perfume and recalls baling Timothy hay as a boy in Albania. The woman distractedly watching a mother debate Robert Colescott's lurid appropriations of modernist art over Niçoise salad suddenly frees her left breast from its cup, where awaits the blossoming mouth of an infant wildly reaching for a galaxy of milk behind her dark areola. The sharp coughs of a student carrying a yoga mat. The day's last light edging high rises on the west side so that they seem rimmed by fire, just when the man says, and yet, amidst the wages we pay, boarding the great carousel of flesh. So that much of that poem is all about observation. And I don't know who said it, but someone said, seeing is a statement of personality. What we choose to see says so much about our past and our existence up to that point. It's endless amounts of things to observe, even right now in this particular room. And the flaneur, like the artist, like the poet, is charged with that act of seeing and listening and recording. And what I wanted to record, of course, was the great vibrancy that is a city, particularly New York City. And I also wanted to map my own kind of learning and growth. So for example, we had a whetstone in our house. We sharpened our own knives. I didn't know New York offered a service where a truck went by from neighborhood to neighborhood and you could bring out your knives to this truck and get them sharpened, which is really fascinating. That was on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 12th, I want to say. But it was such a great delight to write that poem because I think seeing is so crucial to what we do.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that my choosing, because Major gave me a whole bunch of his work and I read through everything and chose that, which actually leads me to talk about the project
we're working on. Yeah, I haven't seen it.
The reason I'm smiling is because it would have been done more, but I'm going to just say it. I had an accident a year ago, so I didn't work for a year, and it would have been farther along.
Yes.
So that's why.
Yeah.
That's why there's only 2 drawings on the wall for it. But again, Major gave me all your work because
yeah,
razzle
dazzle,
and
yeah,
has all this body of work. And I mean, there were so many poems that would have been wonderful, and also you're so visual that there's so much there. But I chose this one. I chose a few first, and they weren't.
Can you talk about your selection, how you go about deciding?
I, it's about the way I described how I work similarly, but I will say when I chose why I write poetry, I thought it was such a celebration of art and art making. And that was certainly very interesting, but also particularly because it's not my voice, it's your voice. I mean, I don't know if it's your voice, but it's the poet's voice. And so I thought that was a strange relationship set up, that I would work with somebody's eye, why I write poetry. And it became very, very interesting to me because it was a stand-in for why anybody would do this work, or anybody would care deeply about what they care about. And it suited me because I noticed that with a lot of the pieces that I end up choosing, it's about vantage point, so I'm not the voice, but I'm paying attention to the voice. And so, for example, the first book I ever did is called Privacy, and it's with Richard Ford, and he handed me the story, and it's a voyeur story. So he spies a woman for 7 days and then sees her on the street and realizes she's elderly. And then, I mean, it's much more beautifully written than I just said, but and that's the piece. And so, and that I read for a long time, trying to think, what do I do with this? And then I figured for myself that the way in was, it was about the private act of reading and the private act of seeing. And then I could understand that space between when you look at things or when you read is so incredibly active. And that's a place to work from. So I'm not illustrating it, but I found a way in. And then Why I Write Poetry offers something similar, that I can be in that place and appreciate the screaming while you write poetry.
It occurred to me that you grew up in New York, and your family friend Romare Bearden was also deeply influential, and I was curious about, were you drawn to the flaneur because you recognized quite possibly the landscape that was being portraited in that poem, and maybe place also has factored in as part of your growth as an artist, and how you make
I mean,
work.
I got introduced to all of this, maybe I was too young because of these associations, but yeah, I think it's a highly, it's a wonderful world.
Yeah.
Basically.
Can I throw in a Baudelaire quote about the flaneur, which
Sure.
is that he flings himself toward the world, even though the same figure is described as detached. It's an essay full of reversals in that sense. This is also the moment when I'm rudely interrupting, because as I forecasted, we have lots of interesting things to continue talking about. And at the same time, we want to make space for the audience to get your voice into the room a little bit. And I know we had one question already from the floor. Could I ask, should we start with any from Zoom yet? Okay, great. Then I'd like to open it to those of you in the room, and I'm happy to walk around and bring you this microphone. Would anybody like to, bless you, would anybody like to start with a question?
Hi, I have two questions. One specifically for you, Jane. When you're reading through texts from writers and you're picking poetry or writing to look at or to make work from, what are you looking for, or what is finding you that you're like, this is the one that I want to work with? And then the second piece is, I'm just interested in hearing the process between the two of you, what you're seeing and not seeing as you're going through the process.
So, well, each one of the projects has a narrative, has a story. I mean, how it came to be. And I can tell you about Joyce Carol Oates. The reason I was able to work with Joyce Carol Oates is we have a friend in common who put us together. And she gave me 30 pieces to choose from. And you know, she weighs
She
wrote him that morning.
Yeah.
probably, and 7 of which were unpublished poems. So, and they were very long, and long is not good for me because it has to be typeset. I mean, it would be very dominant to the image if it was so much text. So, and she said, what do you want? I said, a short story. Anyway, so she gave me, so it was the 7 unpublished poems at the time that I was most interested. And it was the last years of the Trump administration. And I was looking for a piece that had gravitas. You know, I really wanted something hard hitting. So I chose this piece called Little Albert. And the book is called Little Albert. And it's the story, it's not a story, it's a poem about the experiment that John Watson did. And John Watson, probably people know who he is. He was supposedly the father of behavioral psychology. And he did this experiment, it was 1920s, I think, with a young child, proving that you could make somebody fearful, that you could make somebody have reactions that they would not have had. And so it was when experiments were unregulated and this little boy was made to be fearful, and he ultimately died, and it's horrible. So so I chose Little Albert. And I just walked around for a year going, why did I choose this? You know, but what I really came to find incredibly interesting is what does horror look like? You know, if you're not going to depict war and you're not going to depict, you know, bodies blown up, what does trauma look like? What does anything look like? And that's actually at the heart of what I think about. And so what does cruelty look like? And that was the premise for the way I made the images. And I don't depict cruelty, but I hope that is addressing something powerful in it. But I had to sit with that one for a year, 2 years.
We have another question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have a question more for Jane. I guess the question coming from a fellow artist book enthusiast, and also, yeah, we're just thinking about sequencing, like when making an artist book, right? So I see there are like 2 relationships in the artist book, like in this particular case. And one is like for each page, for the image, there's a relation between image and text. And another one, especially when the image is not to illustrate the text, then I would really, you know, love to kind of like leaf through the whole book and try to find some sort of like sequencing from the face to the back, or vice versa.
Right.
And so what's your consideration and process in making decisions?
Oh, definitely. I mean, they're all constructed with the sequencing in mind. So each one is different, and they're clues from one page to the next. So they all fit together, but they're all different, you know, but the sequencing is very important because they're meant to be in their box, they have a case, and they're also on the wall. So how they function as a whole is essential. But you can see from page to page, there's clues and keys from color extending from one to the other. So they fit together. But yes, I pay a huge amount of attention to that. And maybe it's visual, or maybe it's in the making of it, but yeah, no, it's very important.
Which reminds me that when Jane did share with me the Flaneur poem, she sent a video instruction on how to open up the poem because she wanted me to experience it, and also how to put it back together, which is, I needed that instruction. But opening it was very interesting because she made certain cuts so that it folded a certain way. And that surprise, actually, and now I want to say the surprise of engaging with artist books or where word image is crucial. I think that that as much as you curated that, said to me the pitch of her care about the poem and how she wanted the words to kind of reach a reader.
Well, the other thing is when the flaneur is folded, with it, when you fold it, it's like you do this hand gesture and the thing folds.
Yeah.
The title goes from page to page, it reads logically the way you would want. It says the flaneur tends a well, like that. I didn't realize I was doing until I folded it and unfolded it. So I don't know.
So I think is 7:10 our correct time? Okay, I think we can fit one more question in this room, but then we're going to invite everybody to accompany our speakers into the actual exhibition where you can continue conversation in that other setting.
Hi, it's such a joy to hear you talk about your work, both of you. I wanted to echo your question to ask Major, when you're putting together a book of poems, how do you think about the sequencing of that work?
Yeah, I got in trouble some years ago using the word arc, and the poet Kay Ryan, unbeknownst to me, was an embedded journalist at AWP and quoted me as, when she hears the word arc, she thinks of cathedrals and something precious. And I'm like, I'm a defend. I think it is precious to figure out the order of the poems and how you want a reader to emotionally and intellectually kind of be carried through. So I'm thinking about that first and foremost, but that may make it sound overdetermined because there is a level of improvisation and embedded moments of just fun. Like, I just landed you a poem about divorce. I need that next poem to kind of lighten it up a bit. The descent, the turning the page should not be one of a vertical descent into one's own circle, but hopefully one in which there's some levity and we're floating along. I know that that's a personal, I'm not sure how a reader will experience it. The most recent book, however, was kind of a retrospective. And so I needed to do a chronological journey. And I started with the newest poems first, but then went from the oldest book up to the last book prior to that one. Yeah.
I'm going to ask Heather to come back up and give us a few closing words before we move across the hallway.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And I always hate to end the conversation because I feel like we just started to engage with it, but thank you both, Major and Jane, and also Kristen for the thoughtful moderation. Many thanks to Vermont and our art community here tonight and abroad through Zoom. I'd also like to thank Sarah Jane, our webinar expert, as well as our events and communications team. As so many of you know who've come to our events, it really takes a large group of people to bring us all together to share these wonderful ideas and thoughts as a community. Tonight's program would not be possible without the support of the Vermont Humanities, as well as the Molly Ruprecht Fund for Visual Arts at the University of Vermont. And Jane's wonderful exhibition, Between the Covers, is presented in part by the support of Mascoma Bank, our BCA presenters for the 2024 year of exhibitions, the Maslow Family Foundation, the Vermont Arts Council, as well as the National Endowment for the Arts. And finally, I would like to suggest for anyone who will stay and join us in the other gallery, Jane has generously agreed to provide these wonderful, I have it all folded up here, but it's part of the exhibition. It's on display. It's her offset lithography entitled 2015. It's available to all of you tonight. Anyone who would like to take one with you, and you can see it on, visible on display in the gallery. And I think it's a wonderful idea, Jane, to provide that to the community. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone for being here tonight. And we love having you here at BCA. Come back again, invite your friends. This exhibition is on view through mid-January. But also don't leave, because we have an amazing exhibition of which Major and Jane will share maybe a little bit more one-on-one with you afterward. So thank you again for tonight.